I'm just going online.
Good morning. Sorry for a few minute delay start. The executive committee went right up to the last minute and we just had to get online. So we're online. We're ready to start. Welcome everyone to the December Policy Board meeting of the Richmond Regional Transportation and Planning Organization. Hard to believe it's the end of the year. Hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving and is ready for the holidays. And hopefully last month's meeting went a little long. I apologize. There's no highlight. We've been doing the jurisdiction highlights. There's not going to do that today. I'm trying to be committed to getting us out of here at a reasonable time, but we do have some things to address. And we will start, as we always do, with the Pledge of Allegiance. Stand as able and pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And again, welcome. You have one introduction to make with VDOT's district engineer, a new representative of VDOT and the policy board, Mr. Totten, Dale Totten is here. We'll have a nameplate for you at the next meeting. You can find so much on Google. I was looking at Google and I found a little bit about your background. And I saw you at least years ago. You were a resident of Cumberland. Are you still?
I am still a resident of Cumberland. Yes, sir. My wife's home place.
Good. Good. Well, welcome and look forward to working with you. Thank you. Now let's have a roll call and we'll go through the process of determining if we have a quorum, and also I think we do have at least one person who
This last one.
two people. So they're joining as we speak. Go ahead.
Town of Ashland, Mr. Hodges,
Here.
Ms. Barnhart. Charles City County, Mr. Atkins.
Yeah.
Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll,
Here.
Mr. Holland,
Here.
Mr. Winslow.
Yeah.
Ms. Carroll. Richland County Chair Lumpkins,
Here.
Ms. Lascalette. Ms. Lascalette is with us virtually. I will note that. Hanover County, Mr. Davis. Vice Chair Peterson. Ms. Pritchard. Henrico County, Ms. O'Bannon. Mr. Thornton,
Praise all.
thank you. And Mr. Brannon. Newkirk County, Ms. Page. Mr. Tiller. Mr. Evelyn. Powhatan County, Mr. Williams.
Yeah.
City of Richmond, Mr. Addison. Ms. Jordan. Here. Ms. Lynch. Dr. Newbill. Here. Mr. Jones. Ms. Nye. Ms. Robertson. Capital Region Airport Commission, Mr. Rutledge. GRTC, Ms. Adams. Here. RMTA, Ms. Dean. VDOT, Mr. Totten.
Here.
Mr. Riblet.
Here.
CTAC, Ms. Guthrie. Here. Ms. Erickson. DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky. Here. Mr. Sparks. FHWA, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Rucker. FTA, Mr. Koenig. Ride Finders, Ms. Tisdale. Here. Ms. Ruffin. And Virginia Department of Aviation, Mr. Harrington.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance, and we do have a quorum.
Thank you. Okay. And you said we have two persons. I'm gonna need your help here. I've received a remote participation request from two individuals, and you'll have to tell me, are they members or alternates, or do you know off the top of your head? You might not know.
Ms. Nelson is an alternate. And we also have Ms. Lascalette, also an alternate.
So we've got requests from two alternate members of the TPO. Can they hear us? Ms. Nelson, we'll start with you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. And I believe I'm a alternate for the CVTA, not the TPO, but I am joining remotely today. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. Mr. Gregory, do I need to? If she's not,
No, we don't.
I don't think I need to go through the process with her. She can just, she's not a voting member. So I'm just gonna move on to Ms. Lascalette. Susan, can you hear us? She told me the other day she was participating remotely, and if I declined the request, I would just hear a click and a dial tone. She wouldn't even gonna say goodbye, John. Can you think we can?
Yeah, I can. I don't have a message from her.
Okay. Well, if we can't, we have a quorum, we'll move on and if we connect with her, I'll address it then. And so I don't think there's any action required by the policy board because I have not taken any action. And Ms. Nelson, welcome. And hopefully Ms. Lascalette will join us. So are there any requests, amendments, change of order to the agenda for this morning?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to request under D, other business, a continuation of our discussion last meeting on cost estimates for projects.
All right. We talked about this at the executive committee meeting and we'll dig into it. But I think I'll just make a note. I'll put it at the first item of other business. And I think the objective is to, and those who've been here are familiar with the discussions we've had a couple of meetings about challenges with cost estimates and the process and local estimates versus VDOT estimates, et cetera. And I think the objective, if I'm right, Mr. Williams, is for this policy board to come up with a direction and a request to tack, to come back with a recommendation to address it. Perhaps a policy change or why the current policy is fine, or is that correct?
All the above.
All right. Any comments? Any other requests regarding the agenda? All right, I'm going to add that item before future meeting topics. And we now have an agenda. I don't believe we need to. We don't need to vote on it. We have the agenda in place. Unless the lawyer tells me otherwise, be good to proceed with the agenda. So diving right into our first action item, approval of last month's meeting minutes. Chair will entertain a motion.
Motion to approve, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Williams,
Second.
second by Mr. Carroll. Thank you both. Any discussion? All right. Voice vote, all in favor?
All right.
Mr. Chair. One abstention from this new vote. Thank you. So there's open public comment period. We'll recognize anybody that wishes to speak to the EPO from the public. If I recall, the rule is if you're from an organization, you're given a little more time, but anybody wish to speak to us? Is anybody on? No requests. Okay, we will close the public comment period and move right into let's see the chair report. Really, I can maybe mention a couple of things that I was going to mention later. Well, we did have the executive committee did discuss the transportation forum. We're looking again, as you all know, holding this in April. The Greater Richmond Chamber has expressed an interest. I think hopefully in the next week or two we'll firm that up and get a commitment that they want to participate. And so they're very interested, and I think we'll continue that discussion. And in January we should be ready to really pin down locations. There was some interest this morning in the Port of Richmond as being a location, and maybe just a stop in the morning and then travel up to Main Street Station. But your executive committee is engaged and working hard on putting together a good transportation forum for April. Recall that we are trying to introduce, broaden it, bring in some of the public through the Richmond Chamber, but then other chambers as well. Hopefully will participate. But I learned this morning they're going to the inner city visit that they're doing sometime in the May or June timeframe is to Kansas City area. So I recall the idea is for us to give them some introductions to what we're doing in transportation, questions that we want them to ask when they go out to Kansas, and there'll definitely be a follow-up with them when they come back to see what they learned. But hopefully the idea is to, and that's not the only purpose of this meeting, but as far as it goes with the chamber and the public, we're hoping to engage them in what we're doing and give them some ideas and thoughts on what they can go out and find out how the community that they're visiting handles transportation things. Other than that, we will talk about future meeting topics later. Mr. Parsons, we're ready for your report.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. Two items listed in the agenda, item A and B under the Secretary's report on item 6. I did want to add one brief addendum to the discussion about the forum. Ms. Nelson is on the line with us from Port of Virginia, and I know that I have had previous discussions with her and the Port of Richmond about site visits there, and there are some logistical issues, but I will certainly be following up and seeing what the options are to report back in January on that type of excursion. I did want to highlight the work status and financial report for October of 2022. That's starting on page 13 of your packet. As you look through and as you review this prior to the meeting, we're certainly on track for the work tasks that are highlighted there. I would ask you to look at the percent of total funds expended for a good indicator of where things are. If you do look at that, you'll see that we are a little on the low side in terms of funds expended. And that is because we have a couple vacancies that we've been trying to fill, and just like everyone else, we're having difficulty doing that. So there is work that needs to be done that we have not been able to pull into the task list from where we are right now. But we still have lots of time left in this year, and we're confident that we'll be able to make those impacts in the areas that we've identified. And actually a lot of that, some of that work is going to be covered possibly under the new agenda item related to cost estimates. So we'll be able to talk more to that when we get there. I'd be happy to take any questions on that. Otherwise, I can move into the CTAC part of the.
Any questions? Regarding the, notice the long range transportation plan is 87% expended. Most of the others are low, but that's you're still on target.
Yes, sir. That's a great question. The LRTP, as you recall, was updated and adopted back
March,
a couple months ago, a year ago, and so that's not a huge task for this current fiscal year. Yeah. One of the things that we are doing, as you know, lots of our work products are cyclical. So we are updating socioeconomic data for the next long range plan. And that update is the bulk of our work for this year, and it's almost complete.
So that goes in this budget.
That's correct. Yes, sir. We knew that had to happen, so we built it into our budget for the current. The CTAC items, I wanted to raise your attention to page 21.
Hold on a second, Ms. Jordan.
Thank you, Chairman. I had a question about on page 19, under systems resilience plan, it says complete analysis of Virginia. Et cetera, identify need to update EV recommendations. Is there any capacity in these studies or plans at the moment to incorporate that need? What are we doing to update our EV readiness?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
I think that we have the capacity in our TPO to be more involved in EV readiness for our region. At this point, in terms of where the federal cycles are, the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth, has developed a statewide plan as part of, I believe they're calling it phase one, is to develop a statewide plan.
Mhm.
MPOs did not have an opportunity to really be involved hands-on with that part of the EV planning network. So at this point, we are communicating with the state that we are ready and able to participate and provide more detailed information for our region when the opportunity arises. So it's a statewide effort right now, and MPOs, I hope will be brought into the planning for infrastructure when the next phase begins.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Parsons, could you speak at all to how you mentioned that we have a shortage? And would you be just mention what are we doing to make sure we are following inclusion and diversity and a selection of persons?
Absolutely, that's a great question, Mr. Gordon. We adopted, I can't remember the timing, but we adopted an updated Title VI plan. I believe it was March or April of last year, which encompasses a lot of the equity considerations and the federal requirements that MPOs have to consider when making all kinds of decisions, but hiring is part of that. One of the other things that Plan RBA has done was to update its procurement policies to include equity considerations and so those all of our framework for hiring and staffing is updated with the desires that we've heard loud and clear from this body as well as the Plan RBA board. So when we advertise a position now, there are new components of the language in the advertisement that pay more attention and highlight the equitable hiring practices that we all want to follow. And that is also part of the interview process when we get to that phase, in terms of being able to understand, being able to clearly communicate to potential hires what our practices are and what our adopted policies are.
Suggestion would be twofold. Number one, let's take advantage of HBCUs in Virginia and outside of Virginia. And also the medium of radio can be very helpful for some groups. That would be two of my suggestions.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I get your question now. We do, since we've adopted those policies, we have expanded the ways that we publicize not just positions, but also public meetings and other types of events and activities that are being undertaken by our boards and organizations. So yes, we are aware of that, and thank you for the advice. We'll make sure we do that.
Mr. Chairman, toward that vein, have we envisioned utilizing internships with maybe the school planning, VCU, school planning?
Yes, sir. We currently have one Wilder Fellow through the Wilder School, and that cycle usually picks up in mid to late spring for the next year. So that is always an option that we currently have utilized Wilder Fellows the last 2 to 3 years, I believe.
Okay.
We also have a connection with the Robbins School at U of R to use their Bonner Scholar program. And we'd be happy to take, if anybody else has other suggestions for ways to attract interns, if you've got experience in your locality, we'd be happy to look into those as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. If I may go back to Ms. Jordan's question, I was trying to understand your answer a little bit better, make sure I understand. Department of Transportation's NEVA formula program requires VDOT to submit an EV infrastructure deployment plan to the DOT and US Department of Energy Joint Office by August 1st of 2022. So if my little Google search is current with that, that means we've reviewed the plan, and it says identified the need to make recommendations. Did you, and you used the word infrastructure too. So what is happening? Are we going to come back to, we've looked at it. If they've told the federal government how they intend to spend the money, what happens now? Do we just get a little more granular in those requests? Is that what we're doing with this?
Well, in terms of infrastructure, I believe that was Ms. Jordan's question, was what we're doing to advance the installation or identification of need for infrastructure. The plan you highlighted that was submitted in August was submitted by the state.
To the federal government.
State developed plan, submitted to the federal government.
That's the plan. It says completed, y'all have completed analysis of that plan. Of the Virginia NEVA plan, impact on the region.
Yes.
And identified need to update EV recommendations. I'm trying to think what I heard you say earlier, just understand.
Yes.
What exactly are we doing next?
We're basically in a holding pattern, waiting for the opportunity to contribute.
Okay, and that contribution will be more specific about, I mean, they obviously have a deep plan of how to spend, but then we're going to get more detailed on that spending.
That is our hope.
And
Yes, sir.
this is all infrastructure, like I'm assuming charging stations, that sort of stuff. Okay.
As I mentioned, MPOs have not been consulted individually yet, or at the statewide level. But we hope that the next phase of that planning effort is going to do that.
Gotcha. Good. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions on?
A comment on that, I appreciate Ms. Jordan mentioning that with the inclusion of the business community, chambers of commerces, and how they are factoring in this so that it is beneficial to the general public as well, in addition to the business community itself.
Mr. Chair, to our CEO's point, I feel that we've not been invited. Is there anything that precludes us from submitting feedback in terms of this item?
Mr. Chair,
Please.
I don't think there's anything that precludes us from submitting feedback.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there is an avenue for it to be received or routed up or included in a record at this point. My hope is that when the next round of planning is initiated beyond that August 1st deadline, that there is more of a, to use the chair's term, a more granular opportunity for MPOs to be at the table.
Thank you. Any other questions? We'll move into our first new.
If Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I wanted to go to the CPAC.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I love the focus on the work program. Thank you very much. On page 21 is a memorandum reporting on the discussion held at the November 17th CPAC meeting. There were two great presentations from Dale Bennett, President and CEO of the Virginia Trucking Association, as well as Ronnie Hobbs from the Smart Transportation Division. He was the Virginia State Legislative Director on their efforts, and that is in your agenda packet for review. As you can see in this update, the direction that CTAC has taken over the last probably 2 years is to focus on very detailed, great information updates from industry leaders and subject matter experts on things that are relevant to the region. One of the questions, and Ms. Guthrie is here, Mr. Chair, as the chair of CTAC. One of the questions that we've had at the staff level is are there other opportunities for CTAC to be involved more in what the policy board does? And as you know, we had a brief discussion about that at the executive committee meeting this morning. So I think that executive committee is considering that and is looking for, understands the question and the concern, is looking for ways to more to fold in the CTAC and its wealth of information and expertise on a regular basis.
Well, welcome, Ms. Guthrie. Thank you for joining us. And I know Chet told me a few weeks ago that you expressed an interest in, and when I went back at the executive committee meeting earlier, I looked at the list of, representative outside agencies, and I think the sense at the table with a smaller subgroup of the executive committee earlier this morning was, there's a lot of broad knowledge there that we certainly, I think we're interested in smoothing the way to get the input pushed up to the policy board. I mean, we know you all have great meetings and comparisons. Do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, thank you. We've worked hard to fill the slots on the CTAC and invited some new organizations to participate with going back a few years ago with the change in our bylaws. We had an EDAC, Elderly and Disabled Committee, and that was disbanded with the expectation that we would have more representation on the CTAC. So we've done that. We have reached out and added more organizations, and I think the individuals are taking a more active role. They would like, we are now trying to understand economic forces and from all sectors, how it affects transportation, how the move toward zero emissions affects transportation. And we're trying to get a better handle on some of those underlying factors so that we can have a broader participation in the long range plan and participate more with the policy board and invite the policy board to work more with us so that we can be in a more collaborative position.
Excellent. Thank you. You do have a broad range of groups that are well represented.
Yeah,
You
yes,
really do.
we have added senior connections, RVA rapid transit, help me. So we added a number of other groups. So
Rada is in there, the bicycle.
yes, they've been involved all of them. Yes, yeah. So it's a good representation of the communities.
Any comments or questions on that item? And I don't speak for the policy board, but I'm sure we're very interested in figuring out ways to, get the communication going and get your input, bubbled up in a more meaningful way. Any comments?
One comment I make, in looking at the memorandum, the impact of COVID on Virginia trucking industry is probably, COVID has probably allowed us a great opportunity to look at regulatory reform. Is what we're doing sensible, reasonable, and safe, and cost effective, if you will. And so you're looking at the shortage of drivers with 80,000 unfilled drivers positions, which is pretty significant. Only it's going to get worse. So we're looking at how we assuage that problem. And also it goes back to the Port of Richmond, which is moving goods from Norfolk to Richmond via the waterways, which is, I think, a future opportunity for us. As a region, as we think about transporting goods, less trucks on 64, for example, or 60, and more on the waterways. Even moving people might be a good way to look at it. Maybe having a business that does that might be something I do in retirement. just a little humor there, but I'm just thinking in terms of what we can do, because I think a big thing that we have to look at in every area is how we reduce costs. How we become cost effective and what we're doing, and regulations is part of that. But we want to make sure they're sensible and reasonable.
Thank you.
Forward. So,
thank you. All right. So now for new business, item B1, federal performance management update. Ms. Ray from OIP joins us, and Chad, I'll let you just give a little introduction and hand it over to Ms. Ray on that.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Many of you around the table know Margie. We have a long history of working with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment on many different things. And one of the things that, as I mentioned to the executive committee, is that RRTPO has taken a real liking to the incorporation of performance measures and performance management in a lot of the work that we do. It's a great way to provide more equity in project analysis and consideration when it's driven by data and is less objective. So we are excited to have Ms. Ray with us today to provide an update on some of the federal side in terms of what the current thinking is and what the expectations are for MPOs.
Great, thank you, Chad. Yes, good morning, everybody. So Margie Ray with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment. My role right now is oversight of a lot of our performance management programs, especially focused on the federal performance management requirements. But our office is also responsible for VTrans, the Long Range Transportation Plan, and Smart Scale, as you all probably are aware of and familiar with, and then also the newer program of Pipeline. So that's everything that our office does. With the next slide, please. Just high level today, I want to run through some of the information related to what some of the federal transportation requirements are for performance management, focusing first on safety and then some of the other requirements. And spend a little bit extra time on safety because I know that's one that's always so important to all of us. And
Can you?
I'm trying, yeah, I am. There it is. Okay, so it was there's actually a bit of history for the performance management requirements. It goes back to MAP 21, the FAST Act, and it's been continued in the most recent legislation as well. So with safety, there are 5 measures that we have to look at. I'll mention that in a minute. We establish targets every year. So that's a big focus for us. VDOT, my office works very closely with VDOT and DMV to look at setting those targets. 3 of the 5 targets and measures have to align exactly. And then there's these annual reporting requirements. That timing always kind of affects when we try to have the targets available. FHWA judges us on how we are on doing our performance. Next slide. And so we look at the number of fatalities, the rate of fatalities, the number of serious injuries, and then the number and the rate of serious injuries, but also the number of the non-motorized, the biped fatalities and serious injuries. That's all kind of combined into a single measure though. Next slide. So when we look at how we're performing, we can kind of see some trends. I know this is a little small for you all to take a look at, but the red is our fatalities, just so we can see that that's not headed in the right direction. The green is our bike ped, and then the blue at the bottom is our serious injuries. The dots and things like that and the triangles all get to where we've been setting targets and then where the actual performance on an annual basis ends up, just so that we kind of see how are we doing with our target setting practices. Beginning in 2019, the Commonwealth Transportation Board utilized a modeling approach to establishing a target. So it's data driven and performance based. This is our projection of where we'll be in 2023 is what I'll talk to. Next slide, please. So this next one just gets to the rate measures, just so that we can start seeing, and it hasn't transitioned yet. But it's just the rates. And so now we're looking at what is the number of fatalities or serious injuries divided by our vehicle miles traveled. So generally and historically, when our vehicle mile travel declines, we would expect our crashes to decline. During COVID, our crashes did decline, our serious injuries, kind of flat, but our fatalities increased. I think we just saw really observe some of the riskier behaviors during COVID and, a lot less traffic on the roads and people could travel faster. So we definitely saw an increase, and that's been of significant concern to all parties. Next slide, please. So what we do though in target setting, I just kind of want to lay that groundwork real quick. It's a 3-step process. We have a statistical model that we try to predict our projections. We try to look at all these different factors that can influence our safety outcomes. And so we look at these factors, we divide it down by district so we can actually look at it at a fairly granular level. We look at it on a monthly basis. You can see all the red ones with the arrows pointing up. These are things that adversely affect our performance outcomes. And then the green ones can help drive things down. So the top one on the list there is the VMT growth. When we have higher VMT, we expect greater crashes and fatalities and serious injuries. But then things like, some other things, well, I guess more just where we've seen some changes in behavior would be some of our population, so older and younger drivers, we're seeing worse outcomes with some of those drivers. So just highlighting some of those things that are not as positive. Next slide, please. So then with that model, the model uses up through 2021, so all of that annual data. Then we're setting targets though for 2023. And so we've got this time period by which our data doesn't capture what's happening on the roads. So what we do is we look at projects that should be completed during that time period. And so we review our smart scale funded projects and our highway safety improvement program projects. We reviewed more than 200 earlier this year. And it had over 5,500 crashes. But we look at we bucket them into 3 categories as far as spot improvement projects. You think about like an intersection type project, hybrid projects, which would be some length of corridor, maybe some adding some of the rumble strips or something like that. But then we have systemic, and that's much larger geographic impact of the project, generally lower cost as well. And so we bucket those. And what we do is we look at what are the anticipated benefits once those projects are constructed in that time period. And we can estimate what those reductions in fatalities and serious injuries are. So that's step 2. Step 3 is basically the combination of steps 1 and 2. So next slide. That gives us what did our model predict? What are the project benefits that we anticipate? That bottom row being, here's the delta as far as what we think our fatalities and serious injuries look like in 2023. So clearly, the numbers aren't in the right direction for some of these measures, and again, a concern. Next slide, please. So our Commonwealth Transportation Board adopted these targets that I just presented to you as our submission to the Federal Highway Administration. They said it's data-driven, we don't like the outcomes, but based on everything that we're seeing with the trends, this might be what happens. So yes, we'll go ahead and approve that and adopt that. But they don't like that outcome. Nobody does. And so they did adopt aspirational targets. Those aspirational targets are based on a 2% reduction per year of fatalities and serious injuries. And that's in alignment with the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, a 5-year plan on how to improve safety outcomes that is multi-organizational and agency plan. But the board also tasked us with reassessing our current investment strategies and how we were doing both with DMV and at VDOT. And what can we change? What can we do better to help drive these numbers down? And so that was actually presented to the CTB back in September. And we are actively working on some of those changes and strategies. Some of it came with some additional funding that came through the most recent Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. She said it quite right, IIJA. And then also through reassessing where are we spending our money that seems to be most effective. So VDOT, obviously that's infrastructure projects. DMV though is looking at some of their behavioral spending. What kind of grants are they providing? Where can we target that money that might have the greatest impact, especially in the short term? Next slide. Well, and actually, so that's it on safety, and I'm happy to answer any questions there either now or at the end.
Mr. Carroll.
You get your data through the TREDS
Yes,
reporting?
we do.
Sure.
Please keep on.
So when you look at the data, have you looked at, because we've seen an increase in fatalities in Sheffield County as well, through more vehicle crashes. And when you look at the data, I guess hopefully you're looking at it critically, and I'm curious as to what it shows in relation to driving under the influence. Not just DUI itself, but DUI. It seems to me that I can't drive around anywhere now without smelling marijuana. I was down at Virginia State University last night and I got out of my car, smelled marijuana. I was down in the city of Richmond the other day, got out of my car, smell marijuana. I see stoplights and I see smoke coming out of the vehicle in front of me, smell marijuana. So one of the things that I'm curious about is since that was changed, are we capturing that data on relating to these crashes? And is that a contributing factor to it?
So I'm going to speak to the first point about the increases in fatalities and some of the causes that we're seeing. Speeding right now is one of the primary ones. And so again, but oftentimes we see speeding combined with another behavioral problems, whether it's driving under the influence or not. So again, it's a combination of behaviors sometimes that are these dramatic outcomes. But then speaking more specifically to the laws that pass in the cannabis usage and stuff like that, what has happened is that there it's a difficult thing to test when a driver gets pulled over versus blood alcohol or, the breathalyzer. So the state police and DMV have been working on programs to hire people and train them that they can be called to the scene and assess the situation. And they are trained in determining drug influences rather than alcohol. So I think it's still time before we'll be able to see that in the data to show those numbers. I think we've seen from some other states that might have approved some things previously that yes, there is definitely an impact, but to put the data behind it right now, I don't think we have those numbers.
Mr. Carroll, is that?
Just one last follow-up. One of the things that I think that DMV does do, and I think is very effective, is they do have a grant program for traffic enforcement for driving under the influence. And I think those programs are effective. I think more. It's like I say to people, what's the first thing you do when you're driving on the road? You see a police car. Most people either look down on their speedometer or hit the brakes. 99% of the time, that's the answer I get.
So the things like the Click Your Ticket or some of those other national programs, Virginia has definitely invested in those, the DMV. There's been a lot of other thoughts about other enforcement programs, especially with speeding, since that's been a critical behavior that we've observed. The challenge we have are resources.
Yeah, everybody's working short.
Yeah, so DMV is working with Virginia Tech on a speeding and crash analysis tool, specifically for law enforcement to use to start trying to target their resources more effectively.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Hold on a second, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you. Yes, Jordan, I had some similar question when it comes to like the data that you're helping inform these plans. Have y'all looked at the increase in the size of the trucks and vehicles and how that has impacted outcomes of accidents? Because just anecdotally, I feel like what I'm seeing is that we're having these massive, huge jacked up trucks. And when you get in an accident with one of those, I feel like your opportunity to walk away is a lot less.
So yes and no, not me specifically, and not necessarily for the purposes of setting targets. Through the V-Trans effort, they have done an analysis, and I believe it's a layer that's currently available on Interact V-Tran, where they have looked at a combination of all truck-related crashes. Doesn't mean the truck caused it, just means the truck was involved. And so I haven't looked at that data specifically, but we do have it, and we certainly could take a look at that and dig into that a little bit more. But it's certainly what happens in these larger crashes, or just, especially on the interstate, you end up also with secondary crashes, when everything starts getting backed up like that. But I don't have any specifics on that right now, but we can dig into that for you.
I think that would be, to me, I would be very interested in that, because I would hope at some point there is a limit how large we're allowing just regular commercial classified drivers to.
And there is a limit.
Yeah.
Currently.
Okay.
And I know that we looked at that as far as letting bigger trucks, and I don't think at this point that's occurring. Just that's also a lot of other impacts to the roadways as far as maintenance and operations.
Thank you.
Mr. Williamson.
Yes, ma'am, you talked about the Commonwealth Transportation Board adopting a plan where they didn't like the data that they saw, the outcomes from the modeling.
Right.
It wasn't what they wanted to see. And you said they adopted an aspiration goal of 2%. That's good. It's aspirational. What in the 2% that they adopted for the goal are they going to do to make that 2% a reality?
So,
And before you answer, is that 2%? That was my question. Is that 2% related to vehicle miles traveled?
no, 2% reduction.
2% is a raw number that they said. Okay.
So if I have 100 fatalities, I want to reduce it by 2%. Again, this is in alignment with our long range, a 5-year plan to reduce those crash outcomes. And so what the board adopted in September was a revised plan on some additional targeted funding. The funding was already there, but now we're targeting it a little differently. Some more advancing what I call these systemic treatments. So it's adding rumble strips to roadways that, at least raise that awareness. So it's something that's very cost effective. We can do a lot of miles for a lot less cost. Spot improvements like an intersection improvement are very, very effective, but just think about the number of intersections that you have to improve. So they tend to be more costly. very effective at that location, just not broadly. So systemic is where we've been investing the last few years. We're accelerating those systemic, but we're also starting to look at where are those really bad intersections that we need to affect as well. So from an infrastructure side, the things that VDOT's in control of, they're just trying to make their investments more targeted and anticipating that will help. Then I think it's really the behavioral side and the DMV funding that's going to be really critical to see how effective some of that is. But they did take a new plan that's a short-term plan, because again, with annual reductions or annual target setting, we want to start seeing those impacts quickly, right? So it's like, how do we spend our money right now that's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck? Education is big right now, but too.
That would be my point. Have we taken a look at our DMV operations and education along with that? Because speed is a pervasive problem, I know, everywhere I go in the county and throughout speed. And always, some cases, dangerous driving, passing on no passing lanes, for example. So I think education, and I don't think we have enough police to enforce all of this stuff that be out there. But I think re-education and reforming it and rethinking it, and communications, PSA would be something that may be effective in getting people to think differently about it versus just changing the speed signs.
So they've studied the data, DMV, and assessed based on some of those behaviors that we're observing, some of the demographics, like where in the state are we seeing speeding and unbelted? Southwest Virginia. So they're doing a lot of targeted messaging there for that specific issue that they're observing there. Where do we see it's the worst? But they're really looking hard at where can we have the most impact with the legal dollars and resources that we have, whether that's human resources or financial resources. So yes, there is a plan in place that is being worked. The tough part is that we have to kind of wait a little bit to see if that seems to be effective. This is not a Virginia specific problem. It really is a national problem that during COVID, increases in fatalities was a nationwide problem.
Mr. Carroll.
So last thing, speed signs that actually showed when you go down the road, you see actually how fast you're going. I can tell you that I was in Maryland. They're everywhere. And I was very aware of my speed, and not to mention that those signs also have cameras on them. We're issuing some just now. I'm not saying that's what we need to do, but I am curious where we have put speed monitoring signs in. Has anybody actually taken a look at the data prior to the signs going in, what the actual speeds were on the roads, and then data after the speed signs been put in to see if there's been a behavioral change? Because I've tried to get a couple of these for some streets that I have in Chesterfield County, and some of what I get from VDOT is, well, they're only for speeds that are rated below 35 miles per hour. Well, I've been in other parts of the state where I've seen them, it didn't matter what the speed limit was. You go down the street and the signs there, in some cases 45, 55 mile an hour zones. And I just think people actually sometimes need that little reminder on the road to see that sign. I think we don't utilize them enough in the state, truthfully.
Right. So from a before after the effectiveness of a strategy, I think is very, very important, something that we're all very focused on right now. I don't have the data that says how effective something like that is. I do know that there has been discussion about it's effective at that point, but how effective is it even before and after that point, much less through time. And so I think that I've heard that there are doing some analysis in some different areas to try some different things to give that. Some of it is more work zone related, especially because we also have that ability to have different cameras in the work zones based on law.
In schools, which I think was a great change that they did legislatively.
That's taken some time to implement, just in getting the cameras. I don't know that VDOT has them out there yet, other than plans. I mean, I know the plans are forthcoming. I just don't remember if we have anything implemented yet. But then I think like Loudoun County and a couple of counties up in Northern Virginia have already started putting some cameras out. It's school zones.
Yeah, Mr. Winslow.
No, I'll make it
She's
quick.
only about
Yeah, I'm
halfway,
not
she's only
yet,
halfway through the
sorry.
presentation.
I'm sorry.
It's very engaging.
On Mr. Carroll's kind of question, though, I would just request that the standards that are used to determine whether these speed signs and other items can be placed or I suggest that they need to be reviewed and updated and the thresholds lowered for allowing them. I have a lot of speeding going on in my district through neighborhoods, and I can put police out there. It's temporary. And so we really need more options on the local level to address these items. And if speed signs are it, they shouldn't require a majority of the neighborhood. Maybe it's a third of the neighborhood. You can't get a majority of the neighborhood to admit that they speed, of course. So, you know, there's some fundamental numbers here that I think need to be looked at from a standard standpoint. We just ask, Mr. Chairman, that.
Well, this is, we're going to go over our allotted time, but this was very engaging, and I appreciate it's just really impressed with the command, the data, because this is going to inform when we talk about our safety plan, our regional safety plan, knowing that we have this kind of, and I trust we really looked at your data, because this can really inform our safety. I know Richmond has Division 0, and we're looking at regional safety plan. It's great. And Mr. Carroll was talking about, you know, smelling marijuana, and I know I'm a little old to have a midlife crisis, but I thought about getting a motorcycle. But I go down the road and I look at people looking at their phone, and I'm like, I don't want to be out here on a bike with all these people racing down the highway looking at their phones on the road. So similar education, I think, was your point. So if that's it on the safety side, we'll let Ms. Ray go to the second half.
And I did pause there just because I know safety is always one that's so important to everybody. So that's why I did want to pause there. But we do have requirements for monitoring our bridges and pavements, as well as looking at what we call some system performance measures. And it's focusing on reliability, congestion, and emission reduction. Just as a FYI, traffic congestion and emission reduction measures from the federal level only apply in Northern Virginia at this point, and that's based on some former air quality concerns and issues. So that is the only place that it's required. Doesn't mean we can't look at it elsewhere, but that's what's required. On this side of the house here, though, we look at a 4-year performance period. And so our first performance period started in 2017. It was baseline year 2017 and ran 2018 through 2021. And we're getting ready to kick off the second performance period with a new baseline report of 2022 through 2025. So we set targets generally on a 2- and 4-year cycle for these other performance measures. With these federal reporting requirements, we do have to submit all of this information to FHWA. It's basically a biennial reporting requirement. So at the beginning of a performance period, you submit a baseline report that's identifying your targets and then your strategies about how you're going to achieve that performance. And a mid-performance report that just as a check-in gives us some time to assess and actually gives us an opportunity to adjust our 4-year targets if deemed appropriate. And then a 4-year at the end of it, full performance report. How did we do? Did we do okay with our target setting? What strategies did we do? Did those strategies work? So we actually had a submission requirement of October 1. FHWA was having some troubles with their submission system. So it's due by the 16th, and we anticipate submitting those federally required reports later this week. Next slide, please. Okay. I'll start speaking about pavements and bridges. So basically, for the infrastructure condition, we're worried about good and poor performance. Both of these are, most of these are now focused on the national highway system. We're on safety measures, we're focused on all public roads. The rest of these measures on the national highway system. And those are the roads that are, kind of carry the largest volumes, are deemed most important by, from a federal perspective, not necessarily from a state perspective. So when we look at our measures for bridge and pavement, VDOT has associated statewide measures covering all of the network, not just limited to the national highway system. So yeah, next slide. Yeah, there we go. No, there we go. So what we look at is good and poor with the pavement conditions, though we do look at interstate versus the non-interstate national highway system. Virginia's the 3rd largest DOT in the country. The national highway system only makes up 13% and 18% of pavements and bridges respectively. So obviously VDOT's concerned about, and from our funding perspective, where we want to invest has to take all of that into account, not just the federal portion of the network or what these measures apply to. I shouldn't say it's federal portion. So the other thing too that's kind of interesting about the bridge measures is it requires us to include and report on performance of bridges, including our targets owned by others. So these are Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. It's not a VDOT owned and operated facility. It's owned by others, but it counts towards our measures for the bridges. But it could be some private bridges. When we look at I-95, Transurban is operating that, so they're kind of looking at it that way. Federal bridges, but then also bridges, the border bridges, everything that's coming into Virginia from Maryland counts towards our target and our performance. So just an interesting little tidbit there. We don't like it, by the way. Next slide. So I want to give a quick high level approach of how we're setting these targets. Really, we're looking at this investment strategy that's looking at a long-term performance. We don't want, while we're setting 2- and 4-year targets, we're really looking at how do we have a long-term sustainable approach to managing our pavements and bridges. And right now our focus is really on keeping fair bridges, which there's no federal performance measure for that, from falling into poor condition, and then also addressing poor, much less focused on good condition. It's not cost effective for us to spend money on a bridge that's in good condition to keep it in good condition. So that's not where we're focusing our resources. So we're really looking at, while they've got a useful life, we want to continue and we want to be a little bit more proactive in how we're managing it. We used to have a strategy that was more worst first approach. This is a more balanced. We're looking at what are the things that we can do to enhance the life of a structure. And so this does result in a slight decline in performance in good, anticipated and expected, and a slight decline in our poor conditions, so a little bit more poor, but that's just kind of like a little blip as we start moving into this longer term investment strategy. So that's the statewide approach, and then we kind of extract the federal portion of that to help set our targets and monitor performance. So again, it's a statewide process that is driving our strategy. Next slide. So when we look at performance, we can see in red across the row at the top that our good performance, we haven't met our targets there. There's some good reasons for that. We barely missed the 2021 performance. And then we've set these targets. You can see a slight decline in our good performance. Again, that's not our focus. Our focus is on the fair. And you can see that the fares increased through that first 4-year performance period. Poor has remained relatively stable. Slight decline in poor, but it's not significant. But significance is not the right word used there, but it's not a concern, and it is by design, and that's anticipated. We've set targets now for that we think they're not very conservative. This is our projected performance, so there's not a lot of buffer around this, and that's partly why we missed our good performance and that we were not that conservative with those estimates. This is where we thought we would be, and I think we missed the top one there on the right by 0.2. So we're pretty good at predicting, just missed it a little bit. And I highlighted those two because I mentioned that the FHWA will judge us on how well we did addressing our targets. And so it just requires a little extra reporting on our part that we didn't here. Next slide. So similarly with pavements, again, this long-term approach, and I should probably just highlight too, this all goes back to a 2019 report that was submitted to the General Assembly. It was called the Maintenance and Operations Comprehensive Review. So it was looking at not just pavements and bridges, but all of the assets that VDOT is responsible for and coming up with this longer term investment strategy. So same thing, we've got these detailed models that can predict our performance. We take into account how much money we have, and we start looking at what does our future performance look like based on the fact that we really want to look at this long-term sustainable approach to managing those assets and extracting the federal component from that statewide approach to get to our federal measures. Next slide. So on our bridge, on pavement side, we're pretty steady on the good performance for the pavements and actually have improved our performance in the poor condition over that 4-year performance period. And then actually a little bit conservative here with targets so that we've got some flexibility. So if something major happens, we can, I think sometimes funding gets diverted from our pavements and bridges to help with other things. So there we are with infrastructure performance. Next slide. Oh, sorry, the first one was the interstate system. This is the non-interstate system. Next. So these are the system performance requirements measures. And so we talk about reliability and why is reliability important to us? A lot of times we think about congestion and delay, Well, reliability is also the consistency of, and the reliability, how often can we travel and know that we're gonna get there on time? So while I know I have congestion going to work every morning, sometimes I can't predict and I can't leave at the same time I'm leaving. So it's congested condition, but one time a week, it's taking me a lot longer because there's been an accident or something like that that's causing a problem. So we want to start understanding how can we improve reliability so that while we know that we're going to have congested conditions, we're still moving. So really what we're looking at is day to day and across the different times of the day. So we focus on 4 performance periods for the first 2 measures of looking at like our AM time period, midday and evening, and then overnight. And then with the truck travel time reliability, we also look at the weekend travel as a different time period. Next slide. So just high level with how we set the targets here for the person miles traveled that are reliable on the interstate. We have a predictive model that takes into account like 30 different variables to try to understand reliability on the interstates. We try to looking at projects that will be implemented and say, how can that improve our reliability? So like if we're widening a road, that hopefully would improve our travel time and our reliability. But we also do things, operational strategies, like now we've got more safety service patrol out there. So we're clearing incidents faster, things like that that can help improve our travel time and the reliability of that travel time. Then the non-interstate, it's very hard to model that when you think about traffic lights and things like that, and entries onto roadways and lots of different roadways that we're dealing with. So it's difficult to model that, but we still just look at a statistical approach, more of a kind of a regression analysis that looks at, if it was reliable in the past, will it be reliable in the future based on what we know. And then the truck travel time reliability also looks at a statistical approach to understanding reliability on the interstates. One is just an index. The first 2 are based on a threshold, and we do find in Virginia that threshold may not be best to reflect our conditions because most of our interstates and roadways are very reliable in Virginia, and yet we know that there are problems out there. So sometimes we look at using other measures. Next slide. So just when we look at our performance, I mentioned that 85%, 6% of the interstate is considered reliable for this measure. Where we have a lot of those reliability problems are going to be in our urbanized areas. But we can also see the impacts of COVID in this measure a lot. So when we look at the data for 2020, we can see interstates were 93% reliable versus 82, 83 before. And I'm still seeing some of those impacts into 2021. So in setting our targets, we kind of had to say, okay, what's the new normal for us? Do we consider things that are occurring most recently, or do we go back and say it's 2019 kind of more consistent with where we think we'll be in the future? So those are some of the things that we've been taking into account as we looked at setting our targets. Next slide. So just more of a mention. So we look at annual hours of peak hours of excessive delay. And so it's when is our travel the worst on the interstates? And then also looking at non-single occupancy vehicles. So we want to enhance commuting opportunities, road share. So we're looking at other ways to get to work to remove cars off the road to help improve both our air quality and congestion and reliability. But then we also have these total emission reductions measures. These are based on CMAQ, congestion management, air quality funded projects. And so again, only applies in Northern Virginia. So next slide, I'm kind of passing over this one a little bit. So that's how Virginia set its targets. The board adopted the targets in September, and we will be submitting those reports to FHWA, like I said, this week, that reflect those new targets, kind of document the current investment strategies and a lot of that information. But now we look at what do the MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, have to do. So there are requirements that you all have to set your safety targets 180 days after the state has submitted its annual report. So it's February 27th, 2023 that the safety targets will need to be established. You all are able to adopt the statewide targets or adopt an MPO specific target. If you're adopting the statewide target, you just agree to program projects that help support the state. Then we just collect that data. It's not required to be submitted to the Federal Highway Administration. We collect it and maintain it. Then, but Virginia or VDOT has developed an Excel-based tool to help everybody set their targets or at least look at the data and dig into it a little bit more. Richmond has been a little bit delayed because of the change in the MPO boundaries. And so they've had to go back and recalculate the vehicle miles traveled based on those changes to the MPO boundary. So it is now available as of this morning. Greta, as of this morning, it's available. And so that, again, they can look at the data and decide how to set the targets moving forward. But we really had to take a big look back in time to be able to update the model to reflect all of this. Okay, next slide. For the infrastructure condition and the system performance, MPOs are required to set a 4-year target, whereas the state was required to set 2 and 4. So you just have to do the 4, and you have to do it 180 days after the state establishes its targets. We define the date as September 21st, 2022, which is in the CTV adopted the targets. So March 20th, 2023 is when the MPO targets are due. And again, you can choose to adopt the statewide targets, or you can set your own targets. I believe for Richmond MPO, you all adopted definitely pavements and bridges, but I believe the reliability targets for your region as well in the last 4-year performance period. We make available all the annual data, and so there's a folder that staff have access to assess and evaluate the data. And then we also have provided some information that gives projected performance that may be utilized to set targets as well. And actually, I've got to update this because truck travel time reliability measure is also available already. So that's it. I'm happy to answer some of the other questions. One point I want to make about target setting as you all look to this approach. You really kind of have 3 key philosophies in setting targets. One is, what's our projected performance based on all the things that we're already doing or planning to do during that performance period, whether it's an annual or a 4-year performance period. And so that's how Virginia has approached it, as far as based on the data, where do we think we'll be in 1 year or 4 years. Then you also have kind of that aspirational approach, that can be much more policy based. We have a strategic highway safety plan that says for us to achieve our long-term vision 0 goals, we would have to have a reduction of 2% per year for X number of years. So more of a policy based, but setting aspirational goals or targets. And then you also just have a conservative approach that, it's either maybe you don't have a lot of history and understanding of setting targets, maybe there's not a lot of data. So you're just setting something that's conservative to make sure you achieve it. Some of those, some are more difficult to explain than others. And so it's just kind of the strategy approach that you can take a look at. Again, safety, I know everybody has concerns about setting targets when we show increases. And so to have the aspirational approach that's adopted, I think is really valuable. There are a lot of states from a federal perspective that established targets as 0, match their vision 0 goals. However, how realistic is that? And is that helping to drive their strategies, investment approaches? So I think it's really it's a great conversation to have and figure out, how you all would want to manage and do that, whether that aligns with state philosophy or your own philosophy. That's it. Any questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Williams.
I would first like to comment on those states that are doing the zeros for the target figures. That makes for a bad report card, doesn't it?
It does, but it's all about the public debate you want to have.
It's all been driving to the same thing, and that's the best possible outcome.
I think we all want to do that.
I have several questions. You, and this is for staff as well. You talked about the modeling that you do with 30 inputs, looking at reliability and things like that. What is the difference between the modeling that you do with your 30 inputs and our travel demand model that we use here locally? And again, this is for staff. Feel free to jump in.
Please.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, that's a great question by Mr. Williams. I think that to take a step back, the reason we asked Ms. Ray to come today was because, as she mentioned at the end of the presentation, we have some actions that this body is going to need to take in early spring to establish the targets for the MPO. And
That's gonna be my next question, but go ahead.
so we thought that the background would be good for you to have in advance rather than at the meeting where actions requested. So you have this in mind as you consider the updates. Depending on the year and the approach, in the past, the MPO has adopted the state targets. They have taken their own direction to adopt different targets, depending on the data that's available from the TPO staff. It depends, I think is the question, is the answer, depending on what data is available at any one time, but they all work together. So our targets are developed heavily with the input of the state and the data that's been made available and all the resources that are being able to be provided at the time. And then we take that into account as we look at what we've developed in our long range plan and the other sources.
That was my question. That was gonna be next. If we have the flexibility of either going with the statewide objectives or developing our own or combination thereof, what is the relationship any given year to what we adopt to our long range transportation plan? How does that factor in to our decision making with the long range transportation plan? Because I'm not sure I've ever seen that relationship, be brought forward. What I've seen is we vote on a long range transportation plan, and then we might vote on the objectives, but I'm not sure we're doing them in tandem.
And that's a question for Mr. Parsons. So
Yes.
are they,
Are we having concurrent conversations
Yes.
as one relates to the other?
Yes, they're absolutely connected.
Okay.
And part of this last LRTP was incorporation of all of these data sources in our project evaluation. So when we look at a project for potential inclusion in the LRTP, safety impacts and capacity and mobility were all part of those tools to evaluate where this project should rank. So absolutely, these are connected and they are included in our evaluation now.
Good.
Not just for the LRTP, but for our TIP, for our other products that we develop, even for the CBTA.
And if I can add to that and give you more of that statewide perspective, and then actually it was part of this was a federal objective that we want to improve performance-based planning and programming. So it's linking our long-range transportation plans to a lot of these shorter, like that strategic highway safety plan is a shorter range plan. So how we're programming our funding on a day-to-day basis. So, here's what we can have over the next few years. Obviously we're looking at a 6-year improvement program for Virginia. And so how are we tying where those actual investments, how do we make those decisions to get those investments? And all the factors that you used in evaluating the projects align with these national safety goals and with both the state's long-range transportation plan and your own long-range transportation plan. So it does link it all together. And, to some degree, we're able to, some of what we're doing is assessing what do we anticipate those actual benefits will be. So then what's important is how well did we do in both estimating with an actual performance, and that's a different.
Thank you.
thank you, Mr. Williams. Other questions?
One last one. I know we look and we see a lot of statistical data that's being utilized to come up with these performance measures. But do we talk with anybody actually in public safety that actually deals with all of this? In other words, because regionally, a traffic issue in Charles City County may be different than a traffic issue in Chesterfield County or Powhatan or even downtown City Richmond, for example. And so the public safety people, fire, police, and sheriff that are out there working every day, the ones who respond to these calls for service. I'm curious as to how we derive input from them when we come up with these performance measures.
So from a development of the strategic highway safety plan, that engages a lot of public partners, whether it's DMV, VDOT, Department of Health. We start thinking about some of the health impacts that come from crashes and things like that. Department of Education, state police. There's local law represented by local law enforcement. So I can't even know, I'm not part of that group, so I don't have it for me, but it is a very significant number of partners that are engaged in that dialogue, and they meet regularly, not just when they're developing the strategic highway safety plan. Just to really start trying to think about how we can influence and impact these things. You know, I don't know if, Mr. Totten has to deal with some of that too. I mean, obviously you got state police right here, so you're hearing a lot.
Sure,
about safety.
sure. We certainly deal with that more at our residency level and our operations level here, but that's sort of absent the discussion of that. That's more of a on the ground situational issue specific to location by location, not really the data. I think Mr. Carroll's after, how does the law enforcement or first responders fold into the data side of it? And candidly, we touch base with them more on the specific incident. We're very active with them on the incident management and the quick clearance side of things. They're engaged in that aspect of things where they have input on that can improve our metrics. But by and large, that's really one of our functions where we have a dialogue through staff, our operations, our residencies at the local level, one by one, rather than driving the data. Really, that's, I think, more productive to solving a problem when we see one, and hopefully the downstream effect is if you're solving the smaller problems, that the larger data bears out the improvement at a later date.
But I think this also, because there's this engagement across many, I mean, I'm talking about transportation here today and some policy changes that have occurred because of these conversations. But you're seeing that at other agencies too, because of these the dialogue that's occurring is what changes do we need to take, and if we can influence something, what changes are we making that can help have some influences? So it's a very broad audience that gets engaged in this.
Other questions? Ms. Ray, I want to jump back to the bridges. You sound like there's a shift. You've got the shift in focus. Your use of the word performance and seem to tie to condition, or your slides and words with condition. That just made me out good. How about capacity? You know, the bridges that aren't can't carry a tanker truck to go to fire, so folks have to, fire rescue has to go longer, different routes. And I'm sure that's throughout the state and rural areas. Is condition of a bridge good? Is that also the measurement of capacity?
Yeah.
So
Where that gets taken into account would be prioritizing the funding to some degree. And it looks like Mr. Todd wants to say something.
So I think what you're in capacity, you're talking about load rating is what you're talking about, the ability to carry heavy load.
the capacity for numbers of vehicles, but particularly capacity to load.
Right, so it gets captured in, Margie mentioned the good fair ratings. We do a rating of every structure from 0 to 10 that defines its structural condition, if you will. And basically, when we downpost the structures, because its condition is in some stage, or it's in the structural analysis requires us to reduce that available capacity from the structural load. With regard to adding capacity from a number of vehicles or lane width, that's more of a funding discussion and what type of funding we're using to improve it. But by and large, you know, the measures we use are, at least at the VDOT level, it's sort of it's two things. One, it's general condition rating, sufficient or non-sufficient, and then an average general condition rating. Those are our two targets that we try to work towards improving. And the inspections do dictate the capacity from a load rating standpoint, if you will, but from improving a bridge to widen that lanes or those types of things, that's probably more of a funding discussion and the type of money you're using. I don't know if that helps.
Well, thank you. This was very important. Any other questions? I know I leaned over it and asked Chet, is this in our work plan and funded and not? Because that's, you know, again, this date's coming before. We were talking about how the transportation forum is going to be here before we know it, but this is going to be here before the transportation forum. So March is coming soon. So I think policy board is going to have an opportunity to have a good discussion. Ms. Ray, I appreciate you just putting it very candidly. You know, what kind of debate do we want to have? The aspirational, but I think CGB kind of, it sounds like they have the same dilemma, and so here's the numbers we will adopt and we don't like it, and so we're going to put aspirational. My question is, if we adopt, and it goes to what Mr. Williams was asking, I believe earlier, if we adopt our own, do we, and this might be more for staff, but will there be an opportunity for us to look at how we performed relative to for the components that where we didn't adopt last time the state numbers? Do we have an opportunity to measure our own performance against our own measure? You know, because that's what a lot of what you do is like, how do we perform versus our goals? If we adopt slightly different goals, I think part of the discussion we have to have is, how did we perform relative to what we adopted? Are we gonna, do we have that data? Do we have that opportunity?
Well, that's the rub if we adopted our own targets.
Which I think
we would
we
have to
did,
have-
didn't we? Didn't you answer the question? We did adopt some components, or at least were.
Previously, yes. But the issue comes that if we were going to do that, we would want to make sure that the data was available to measure that performance.
Correct.
Whereas if we adopted state targets, the state is helping us and is providing that assistance with all the data that they've already collected, which you've heard today. So that's kind of the question that I think TAC will be discussing over the next month or two before bringing a recommendation on which direction the policy board.
Well, Ms. Ray, while you're here, do you have suggestions? How do other NPOs typically handle it? And is there a benefit to adopting one versus the other, or what are the benefits and the downsides?
I will, so in the first performance period, I think it was a learning curve for everybody because we hadn't done that before. So most adopted the state targets. I think it also is how the funding structure in Virginia works that becomes a factor in here. If you don't have the funding to affect pavement condition, you have to go to the state to get it. Is there value in spending time setting your own targets that you can't necessarily influence through investment strategies versus adopting the target, the state's target, and following that investment strategy? With that said, you all do have some more funding now with CDTA, and you have your regional funding and some other funding programs that can influence those things. And so I think sometimes it's looking at where can I influence it through investment strategies. Certainly the priorities and the way that you all have enhanced your ability to look at projects through your long range plan, I think gives you some insights into what you can influence. It also, again, in adopting a statewide target, you're agreeing to program projects that support the statewide target. Again, maybe you're not programming, but maybe you're submitting various projects through Smart Bill or other funding programs to help support it. So I think it's kind of that debate of, what can I really influence versus what is it where the state can probably influence it better than I can.
That's, thank you. Does that prompt any questions or any wrap up here? That this is very informative. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, we will jump right into agency updates, right? No, I'm sorry. What am I did that second. I'm watching the clock and getting. So yeah, one reason we're here is that action item. I don't want to skip that.
Please don't.
No, there's one for Chesterfield in here too. So yes, we'll do this right now, Mr. Winslow. Tip amendment, Mr. Parsons. Go ahead.
Actually, I'm going to for Mr. Bush.
Okay. Yeah.
Chair, members of the policy board. So this is a set of 3 TIF amendments that were requested by VDOT that we're bringing to you for approval. 2 of these are existing projects that are already in the TIF with changes to the cost estimate and planned obligations. One of these is a new project, which is in the statewide program, but it's new to the MPO. It's sort of a result of expanding the MPO boundaries that it's now part of the TIF requirements. So the 2 projects with changes, the first is in Hanover County as the Route 360 widening UPC 13551. This project is TPO directed funding. So everything that's highlighted in yellow on there are TPO directed funds. So the decision to award funds to this project was made over the past couple of years by this board. So part of it is the HIP funds. If you recall, these were fiscal year 22 funds that were required to be obligated and spent quickly. So the decision made by the board was to put it on existing projects to swap out for existing RSTP funds. So that's what's being reflected in this amendment. The other piece of this was additional RSTP funding that was awarded by this board is being obligated on the project. The second project that we have is in Chesterfield County. So this is a smart scale project and it's actually ready to go to construction. So this is sort of the last piece of putting together the package before it can get approval to move into construction. And this project had a cost increase as well, as we've been seeing. So it's $7 million cost increase overall on the project. And the state was able to work with the county to find a solution using safety funding. So going back to the safety targets, this is a project that's been awarded safety funding to address that deficit. So that's the primary change here, and there's also some HIP funding, which same thing, swapping out different flavors of federal money in this case. The last project in here is the one that is new to the MPO. So this is the Clementtown Road Bridge Repairs Project in Powhatan County. That project's already been completed, so this is sort of a final making the numbers line up, close out part of the process. But since this project was not in the MPO previously, before we expanded the boundaries, it hasn't been in the TIP. So what this is doing is expanding or adding it to the TIP to reflect that expansion of the MPO boundaries. And then again, it's adding the obligations that are needed to finalize the project. So TAC reviewed these projects at their meeting last month. TAC unanimously recommended approval with some minor drafting changes. There was an issue in there with the schedules that were not updated, and those have been removed. So the corrected versions are included in your packets. So the action that we're requesting today is that the policy board approve the amendments as included in the attachments in your packets. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Bushing. Any questions for Mr. Bushing? The $7 million jump, it's, you know, it's painful to see. It kind of goes to what we've added to the agenda later. $7.3 million jump on a $21 million project. Do we have any background on the cause?
I don't have that information. I would for Chesterfield County if they have additional information they can provide.
Yeah, I'm not prepared. I don't know all the details. I would expect a lot of it just has to do with the market right now. You know, cost for projects if they're going up.
Do you know when the original, how long ago was the original number?
This was an early smart scale project. One of the earlier rounds, probably around.
Large scale 18.
I think I can provide a little more detail. The earliest date in the dashboard 2017. So
2017, 2018. Well, that amount of time and what's happened over that course of time. But any other questions, Mr. Bushing?
No, Mr. Chairman, I move approval.
All right, there's a motion by Mr. Winslow to approve the TIP amendments, second by Mr. Williams. Any discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hodges,
Aye.
Mr. Atkins,
Aye.
Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Mr. Holland,
Aye.
Mr. Winslow,
Aye.
Chair Lumpkins,
Aye.
Mr. Thornton,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Ms. Carmack. Aye. Ms. Jordan. Aye. Dr. Newbill,
Aye.
Ms. Adams,
Aye.
and Mr. Totten. Thank you. That motion carries.
Thank you all. Okay, rolling right along. Transportation agency updates. Mr. Parsons, CBTA update.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 28 is the CBTA update. I did want to highlight two main points from the information in the packet. On the November 12th fall line working group meeting, that was a significant meeting for the fall line. As you know, there are two design build projects that are moving forward, spearheaded by VDOT. One for the northern section from Ashland through Hanover across the Chickahominy, and one for the southern section from Chesterfield down through Colonial Heights and the Appomattox River. The middle part, Henrico, City of Richmond, and Chesterfield, there was still a lot of uncertainty in terms of how those projects would be identified, how the funding would be moving forward, how the allocation would occur, and when those resources would be available. Through the fall line working group and subsequent meeting of the TAC, a lot of that detail was worked out, and I think there was consensus moving forward through the TAC meeting about what those commitments could be. Obviously, this still sheds light on, we don't have full funding for the entire trail. So knowing where the existing allocations could go and should go, and then the flip side of that is highlighting the additional needs. So I think we are in a very good place at the CBTA now to move forward with the additional commitment of funds for project segments outside of the two design build projects, so that the fall line can be continued to move forward, and we can all do our job now of going out and advocating for additional funding to complete the project. I think the second thing to highlight through the November 9th and 14th Finance and Technical Advisory Committee meetings, we have an allocation scenario of how to move forward with the regional projects that have been identified and prioritized by the CBTA. Up until this point, we knew that the funds were prioritized, but we didn't know when they would be allocated or committed to and for which phase. So now we have an expanded understanding of, you know, the PE, the right of way, the construction of each of the projects, the regional projects, and when those funds can be reasonably expected to be available. So we are now looking towards this week's CBTA meeting on Thursday to look at the allocation scenario with the full authority and hopefully move that forward so that we can get moving with all of our partners to make sure those projects are continuing to get the attention they need. Mr. Chair, that's my report for CBTA.
Any questions, any comments? Ms. Adams for GRTC report.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. One quick update. GRTC along with Plan RVA has a survey going on to look at the possible extension of the current Pulse BRT line westbound. Currently, it ends at Willow Lawn, and the survey is to ask for input to extend it a little bit further into Henrico. And that
online?
Yes, it is online, and that survey closes on December 16th.
Okay, good to know. That's. Is it? I can go check it out. I will take a survey. But is there a plan to ask to go to point X? Do you have a termination point?
Well, there are a couple of them.
Couple of options.
The current, the survey extends all the way to basically Route 2. That's the area.
That's a goose. All the way out there. Okay. Okay. Anything else? Any other updates?
Yes.
Any questions? Miss?
Just
Dr.
really quick, just wanted to get a sense of where you are in terms of the CEO recruitment.
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to report on that. The board actually conducted interviews last week. So they are hoping to have someone in place at the beginning of the year. So they're moving along. They are. I'm not sure after the series of interviews last week if they're going to conduct a second interview. But I think they're going to take it up in closed session at this board meeting on December 20th.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Adams. Ms. Dubinsky.
Thank you so much. So I'll try to keep us as close on time as possible.
No, thank you.
The main item for our update for December is that on December 1st, we opened for our grant applications for our fiscal year 2024 grant application cycle. This is available for all of our rail, transit, and commuter assistance programs. And we hosted a workshop just last month that outlined all of the different grant programs and any changes that we have. I have provided in the meeting minutes a copy of the agency update that also includes key contacts. But feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of our grant programs or about kind of how we administer our grant programs as well. Besides that, it's just a note about transit asset management plan and then about the statewide tip, which I'm sure VDOT may cover a little bit more, but for the sake of brevity, I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to catch up with you maybe and put you on one of our future meeting agendas to do a more detailed presentation, because you're always offering more grant program, to learn more. So maybe there'll be an opportunity to set some time aside where you can do a little deeper dive for this group. But thank you. Any questions? Yeah. And so VDOT, Mr. Ribble or Mr. Totten, do y'all have an update for us?
Yes, thank you, sir. Just in the interest of brevity and everybody's time, I'll just highlight one important item. You'll note in the report included in your packet that we will have a public hearing for segment A on I-64. on December 13th in New Kent County. That's the segment that runs from mile marker 205 to about 211 to 12 neighborhood. That'll be the first 3 segments, and that'll be moving very quickly after the public hearing into the procurement phase very quickly. So making progress there. Nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Button. Again, welcome to the policy board. Thank you. All right, any questions of VDOT? No. So, other business, we added an item discussion of cost estimates. I think with the focus on this policy board crafting a request to the TAC to address the issue of cost estimates, the variance we see between local estimates and how it impacts this body and decisions we make when we look at coping with these cost increases. I don't know how we want to start this, Mr. Williams, if you want to start, or can you get.
I can pick up where we left off, last meeting. But as we discussed in the executive session, we had a good discussion in last policy meeting about how projects are, cost estimates are originated. If it's going to be a VDOT administered project, then VDOT, we learned from Mr. Rivlett, has now moved to a manual that they use for the standardization of cost estimates, which is risk averse. We also learned in the meeting from Miles that if you're a locality and you're administrating the project locally, you don't have to follow that book. You develop your cost estimates independent of VDOT. I believe Miles says VDOT reviews it. I don't know what that means, what all that entails. So the discussion was, when we got to the very end, Miles said, well, if we had the uniformity across locally administered projects and VDOT using the manual for the cost estimates, that would require a policy change. Now, I'm not suggesting at this point, until we get more information, whether that's a good idea or bad idea. I don't know what I don't know. The only thing that I do know is projects are submitted today, whether it be for smart scale, whether it's for the regional surface block grants. We have a scoring system for funding projects. And the scoring system is predicated to a very real degree on getting the most bang for the bucks. So I want to make sure that all projects are being scored fairly the same way. Maybe they are, I don't know. The only thing I do know for sure is I don't know that I can go back and explain it to my constituents, the difference. So I need more information from staff and VDOT as to the differences and why they still exist. Now, it's very easy to say, well, the cost overruns, and I'll give Ms. LaScalette the credit for this. She brought forward the issue several meetings ago, I believe it was in May, that we were having these huge cost overruns on projects. So it was easy at that point to say, well, it's just inflation, supply chain problems. But if there's something else, we should know that. We should be aware of how we're developing the cost estimates for these projects and be assured that we're doing it the best and fairest way possible. So that's the discussion.
Well, does VDOT or staff want to help guide us? Is it, as Mr. Williams, and this is a genuine question, is it that stark divide between locally, the way, the timing and the sequence of how locally administered projects get estimated and when it works its way to the VDOT estimator versus something that's not local? Is it that stark of a question that we're dealing with?
So I guess the best place to start is, I think both are attempting to do the same thing. Everybody's starting with a forecast for 6 years out of what this project is going to cost. And so there's a lot of assumptions that go into it. And I think the biggest difference that we can see is localities don't always make the same standardized set of assumptions that VDOT makes. So for example, there's legislation around right-of-way acquisition and utility work that VDOT has to apply that doesn't apply to a local government. So if they're administering the project, they can have different assumptions there. So I think some of the differences are valid differences in assumptions that go into it. I think what we were trying to bring up as well, though, is we haven't necessarily had any sort of threshold of what is a standard assumptions or I guess what goes into it. So in some cases in the past, we have had things that are very high level planning estimates that, I mean, really probably shouldn't have been funded with that level of detail. And I think that's the concern, is trying to find the balance between valid differences in assumptions and selecting projects that really aren't detailed or scoped enough that we can get a valid estimate. So that was sort of what I was trying to bring out last month, is that there are legitimate reasons that there are differences when the localities are administering projects. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the projects are developed enough and we're not just picking it because it has a low estimate.
All right, Miles, let me help you out.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I understand everything you said, that there's legitimate differences about how you can come up with cost estimates. I understand that. I have no problem with that. What I heard from Mr. Riblet was VDOT is addressing the problem, and they've standardized across the state with this manual and says, this is the way you come forward with a cost estimate, and it's risk averse. So if they are using a manual that they've standardized across the state, and then the locality is saying, yeah, I don't think that's going to be a problem, and it turns out to be a problem, then why are we doing it different ways? And again, I understand why it can be different ways. My question is it serving us to have different ways between the locality and between VDOT, which is standardized on this manual? That's the question. And it might, like I said, it might be, there's very good reasons for doing it, you know, and leaving it the way it is. All I'm asking is, I need to know, this body needs to know, what's the differences, and is it a problem or is it not a problem? That's all.
Let me ask something based on that. Miles, is there a pattern of differences between the stage of development of a locally administered project when it's presented versus the stage of development of a project when it's VDOT administered? Because you described one of the challenges, you know, some of the, you didn't say mistakes, but maybe some of the challenges has been that a project was not developed enough when they're asking for funding. So in addition to maybe the cost estimating not be standardized, there's no standardization of how far a project needs to be developed before funding is considered. Is that accurate?
So I guess the best way I think to look at it is a lot of times for the localities, when you're bringing projects forward, if you don't have your own engineering staff, the estimates come from like a comp plan. So that's a very high level planning. There hasn't really been a lot of scoping work that's done, any sort of, you know, it's far out, it's a big range. There's a low, there's a high, it's kind of out there. Whereas when we go through smart scale process, we get a little bit more of the detail, we get actual property acquisition, like there's a little bit more that's put into it. And I think that's sort of where we're seeing the difference, is a lot of the projects that were selected earlier on in that process tend to have more cost increase over time. The other area where we're seeing a lot of the cost increases are just the older projects. I mean, projects from the 90s and early 2000s that are still lingering out here because they've been so long in development that costs have gone up. There have been changes to the projects. So that's the other area that we're seeing a lot of the bigger overruns. So it's the old projects and then the ones, like I mentioned, that were picked really out of a comp plan as opposed to more of a fleshed out, not engineered, but getting there.
Well, in Powhatan County, I don't have a transportation department, so I'm totally dependent on VDOT. And I'll have to say, you know, we've been fortunate. We've had good engineers in Powhatan County. We've received very good service. So that's not my issue, okay? I think that the question on the table is, you know, what the chairman just said, is there differences in the cost estimating. And again, I depend on VDOT totally, because I don't have a transportation requirement. So any numbers I get, it's gonna come from VDOT. Unless I'm doing a PPEA or something like that. But again, I think we ought to know, okay, you give me some good information about projects that are older projects, larger projects that have been on the books a while and may have had changes. And again, that's a way of accounting for the cost overrun. What I'm looking for today is to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, going forward, this is the way that we're going to do cost estimates for projects, because we don't really know what the problem is. Only thing we know is we got cost overruns, and we can generally assign inflation and these other, causes, but we really don't know. So my goal is to understand today, because the past is important, to make effective decisions in the present. Go on.
Mr.
Well, I'm not sure, my question was going to be, is this a matter we should refer to the TAC and get a response on? That is going to standardization, cost estimates using the VDOT manual. And I'm not sure we're prepared to answer Mr. Williams' question right this moment, but with the tax input, I think we'd be in a better position.
I think we want to go to TAC. But the way you just framed it, do we want to state that question to TAC? We should hear from VDOT and others, because we have to acknowledge that we're not going to tell locally administered counties, the larger jurisdictions that do their locally administered projects. I think it's a non-starter for us to talk about going down a path that's going to really impair the way they do things and to slow things down. This came to light, recall, and I wish Mr. Winslow was here. He remembered, he and I were looking at each other, and when we were talking about that triple cost and it wasn't just the Goochland project, but it was that Goochland project. We had new money, and we had these existing projects. All the new money, TAC staff recommended to take all that new money and to put it into the existing projects. And we looked at all that money and like, well, look at these cost overruns. So I think that was the genesis of this. And then, of course, that led, I remember Mr. Winslow said, well, this is just an incentive that you can slide in your project at this estimate, knowing that in a couple of years when it comes down the road, that, everybody's going to say, well, it's on the books. Let's go ahead and complete it with this extra money. Nobody's saying that's happening. I think to your point, we got to find out what is happening and let's address it. So I'd love to hear from VDOT and their input, because I personally don't want to see this board go down a path asking TAC to do something that is just politically not going to work.
So a couple of thoughts come to mind. We have standardized the cost estimating as it relates to smart scale and all of our other projects, really to be not so much risk averse, if I can paraphrase Mr. Williams, but more be managing cost estimating from a risk management perspective, from an informed perspective.
I was using the words Mr. Ripley used.
Fair enough.
Just one at a time here.
Fair enough.
But
anyway, so we really are trying to make sure that when we're funding the project using a smart scale estimate or a project for state of good repair, whatever, we're using the same methodology. And more importantly, as we're evaluating projects, not just in this location, but across the state, that the numbers that are being submitted for requests for funding are consistent and are accurate and appropriate, regardless of where it is across the state and regardless of the type of project that is, so that when we fund a project, we fund that that it's consistent between for a Chesterfield County project compared to a Goochland County project, that we're using the same core values, if you will. And what we've discovered over the time with smart scale over the last 5-6 years is really we had a need to get consistent. One, we knew there were a lot of market fluctuations. We had to get consistent across from one district across the state to another. And that's the only way we can keep a level playing field. Certainly, I think localities that have other funding sources outside of VDOT funding or state or federal funding certainly have flexibility offered to them that they can deploy funding faster or more in a different fashion without using those resources. And we would hope they would use good engineering judgment, but that doesn't always translate to the same value you get going through our estimating process. Certainly, we interact with localities that pursue projects with their entire local funding through various approaches, and that's permissible, and we're certainly going to not discourage that. But I think the reality is that part of it, and it was hinted at earlier, part of it may be how readiness of how far along the project is when it's submitted for funding and how well ever your estimate is prepared. I think we're better at that now than we were in the past. I think that, I think you just have to decide whether it's important to be consistent or not. I think that's really the question Mr. Williams is trying to get at. For us to receive state or federal funding, it's entirely important for us so that we can get a 6-year plan that is well programmed, well managed, realizing that we do have constraints on funding. Through Smart Scale, we have controls based on estimate changes and things of that nature. We have a rules framework that dictate additional funding to projects. So that's the other driver behind trying to get projects consistently estimated on the front end of the projects to minimize the number of times you have to go back to seek additional funding. Remember that when a project is funded in our 6-year program, it's fully funded with the anticipation that you don't have to go back to the well, and it's funded at day one once it enters the project, which is a very different strategy that we've evolved to over the last handful of years. So I don't know if that helped.
Well, it does, and maybe there'll be some other comments, but when you talked about consistency, is there consistency like a project? We have to be a certain way down the road in terms of engineering and development, and maybe not engineering, but at least development, before you'll even say this is time to run it through the estimator?
Well, we certainly start with planning level estimates during the conceptual study phase or corridor study or an intersection study. Perhaps we will have an estimate done at that point in time. And certainly, I always try to use a funnel or a trumpet, if you will, that when you're early on in the project, your estimate has a wide range to it, and as you narrow the scope and define it, your estimate has a much narrower footprint. Certainly, when you start with a planning level estimate, corridor study, intersection study, alternatives analysis, whatever it may be, you have a much wider breadth of estimate. The idea is when you're submitting for funding through VDOT anyways, you go through a readiness evaluation and you've done that preliminary engineering work enough. You've done the operational analyses, you understand what alternatives are and what they cost, and that translates to then an estimate that leads to funding. But certainly if you're submitting without doing some engineering work, I know some folks feel like we do probably too much, but that translates to an estimate on the front end that we can fund a project and feel like it can move forward with a lot of confidence that once it's funded, it's ready to go and to go through the design development process.
So as we're trying to develop what we're asking TAC to do, I think when we can say, everybody needs to use the same estimator, that's one question. Or do we maybe need to get to a point where people, the localities, if you're going to come to this body for any sort of participation, you have to get to a certain point before it can be considered. And you have to meet, whether you do it that way, your locality or not, you have to get to a certain point. So I'm just looking for where do we need to drill down, where do we need the consistency? But I'd like to hear from some of the bigger jurisdictions like Chesterfield that you do all of your local administer all your projects. Mr. Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think that there is what we've seen, whether it's to some estimates that have been done through VDOT or estimates that have been done through localities, we've seen increases. The question that Mr. Williams brought up earlier was why? What is the actual core reason why we're having increases? The way to look at that is you look at the data. You actually can look at the project and say, why is it now costing more? Is it just because it's an older project that's come forward, or is it because when it was submitted, the preliminary engineering wasn't included in it? But let's look at the projects that we have and see why we're getting the increases. That'll figure out if there's a problem where what we're submitting or what the problem actually is. we've seen, I'm not trying to be mean here, but we saw it in a project that was submitted by Goochland to VDOT that came back. Oh, was it, and we gotta redo this. It happens. And I'm not trying to throw VDOT under the bus for it. I'm really not, actually. And we supported that project for Goochland to get the funding for it because it's an important project. I think to get the nuts and bolts of what it is, we got to look at the projects that have come over, and that should give us an idea of what happened. I do think from an upfront standpoint, every locality that's putting in wants to make sure that their project is at least being estimated the best they can, so it can actually compete in a smart scale process. I don't think we want to set something forward that we can see fail. And so I'm interested in what the data bears out as to what the actual reasons are. That's what it is. And then if we find from that because of that there is a big difference between what VDOT's doing or locality, so then we need to look at it and say, maybe we need to collectively look at it, but we don't have that data right now.
Dr. Newman.
I have a time constraint. I don't think that we're going to get to resolution in this matter. I concur. I think a comparative analysis that allows us to look at the projects and when the estimates came in versus the time that came later required an increase in funding will be good. I would recommend that we get that kind of analysis. Also, the difference between what VDOT has also recommended in this case is that we really do have to take the opportunity to look at the data and understand this, the circumstances that are driving this, and then come back with any policy change that we might need. I don't think we're going to get to closure with that today without that information. And so CTAC can have some opportunity to make recommendation through that, but also our staff. What are others doing? We're not the only TPO that are having this kind of challenge, I suspect. But they're putting in, and when that varies by the time we get down the project, is there some policy components? I would just ask that we take time to do that and not an extended period of time, because I think the question does need to be answered, and it is, is a real concern. So.
I think so. I don't think we'll have a question, but I will try to, if staff could come back. I don't know how January's looking, but I think we realize it's several issues, several pieces going on here. If you could really come with a solid recommendation, I think the overarching, and Mr. Williams, and I'll echo, I think we want it to be fair. I mean, not to get some project Mr. Carroll was talking about a moment ago, but the one that we voted on, the Hockett Road, I was so frustrated with that. I was the only no vote on that. And so I just don't want to see that happen. I don't want Goochland causing it. I don't want to find myself having to support another jurisdiction's project that looks like it didn't arrive to the point fairly as Mr. And it seems like when things are that out of kilter, something has happened. So do you guys have enough from this discussion to come back and
Yep.
with some recommendations and just help this board guide the discussion of how to frame the question to the TAC?
Sure. I think what we have available, as I mentioned last meeting, we do have the catalog of all of our active projects, and when they first came in, what the estimate was, what the current estimate is, and we can tell you how much funding we've allocated over those years.
Can you share that with us before the meeting?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to get that data in the policy board, not the day before, but a couple of weeks before, please.
If I may, Miles, I don't want to just look at the project as a whole. It would be instructive to me. We're going to look at the data, and I totally concur with Mr. Carroll. Then I would like to look at the different phases of the project to see if the cost overruns are occurring in what part of the system of the project development. As Mr. Todd said, there's differences. So I don't want to just know that the project A from Chesterfield County was less than the VDOT project from Powhatan. I want to know, is there anything variance between the different stages with preliminary engineering and then the actual moving forward with the development of the project, where is the problem occurring? Is it the front end, the middle, the back? Where is it occurring?
Yes, sir, we can provide all.
Okay, I'm with Mr. Curley.
I'm sure the larger jurisdictions, their transportation focus, transportation teams are very focused on this. I mean, it's in everybody's interest to get it right and not come back and ask them for more money. So, Mr. Thorne.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to make this sound simple in any way, but I think we have the people, I think we have the mission to get together. This is really an opportunity. So that we get together and hone the system that we're looking at. So it'll be efficacious for District 15. And so I'm looking at this not just as a problem, but this is an opportunity. So maybe this is good that this has come up now for us to rectify it. And it can be done. We just got to come to the table, get everyone to participate and make sure we're making the right decision and we have all the data and information. I think we can do that.
Yeah, Mr. Parker.
Some clarification. Are you, it's a request that you're formulating for staff to come back to the next meeting with a staff opinion on how to then work with, are we to go to work with TAC now? I guess I'm trying to figure out when the TAC comes in.
No. Again, input of the folks that are still hanging in here, if you disagree, but I think next meeting, or certainly by February, and like Dr. Muda said, let's don't drag this out. But in the next couple of months, as we get into the new year, let's have a good question to ask the TAC to answer. So I'm not saying go back to work with the TAC. Now, if you need to, I mean, obviously you may talk to, but I don't think the goal today was to come up with a request to TAC to make a recommendation how to address the problem. I think we still are trying to define the problem a little bit. So if you can help us ask the right question to TAC, come back. I think we know the different parts of this.
I agree with the chairman for what it's worth, because right now we're in a discovery stage. Going back to Mr. Curl's recommendation, we look at the data. Let's look at the data and see if we do have a problem. You know, problem solving starts with problem identification. We're not really sure what the problem is right now.
But we do know we've had to.
We do know
We
there's
do know
something.
we've had to add a lot of money to some projects, and it seems like something broke down. We
Yes.
heard Mr. Bushing say earlier that some projects did probably get funding before they were funding ready.
Correct.
So. Thank you all. All right, I want to let everybody go home and get started on holidays here, but we're gonna. A few minute things, future meeting.
Start on luck.
Future meeting topics, you all see those in there. If you have any suggestions, please bring them to me. If you have any thoughts, you'd like to hear from something, but I think we've got the next, what is it, the next couple of months covered. We have those. Yeah, we've got CTV safety targets. Aspirations, okay, we talked about that. So we're gonna actually get a report from, a more detailed report than we got today.
Well, we'll take action then.
Because the March, I figured we'd take action in the March meeting for the March 20th.
Different, we heard about 4 different targets.
Okay.
Today, and each one has a different.
Okay. All right. So that's coming up soon. Again, if you all have, well, we'll have the transportation forum. We're going to be focused on that. But if you do have things that you'd like to hear from, let me know. Anybody have any comments? Next meeting, remember, we're in the new location in Richmond and in Manchester, Hall Street, nice area. Looking forward to seeing our new digs, and y'all are going to be moving into that in maybe in the next couple of weeks. Mr. Carroll.
Just want to wish everyone a happy and safe holiday season. Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving as well.
Exactly. I'll repeat that. I wish everybody safe holidays. good time with family and friends, and look forward to seeing everybody in January at the new location. Thank you all for coming out to Chesterfield. Thank you, VDOT, for hosting us. I know we'll make sure that we really do appreciate it. This is a nice setting, and it's good to be in Chesterfield again. Love coming to Chesterfield. No, we're adjourned. Have Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
Good to see you. Next 3 days, right?
I will. Actually, Sherry.